Hey everybody, thank you for joining me for another episode of Regulatory Voices. Today I'm joined by Sterling Chung. Regulatory Voices is a platform where I interview and speak with people across regulatory affairs in the pharma and biotech space, share their career journey, insights and expertise. Once again, joined by Sterling Chung, who is the Chief Regulatory Affairs and Quality Officer at Aurion Biotech. Sterling, thank you very much for joining me.
Thanks for having me on, Connor. Appreciate it.
No problem. Before we get into the topics, I'd love if you could give everybody a bit of a high-level overview of your background and career so far, and how everything's going at the moment.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity to talk about regulatory. Not too many people ask about it, so I appreciate it. In terms of background, I've been doing regulatory for about 20 plus years. Right after I came out of university, I had this opportunity with Abbott in a professional development program, 6-month rotations, doing different parts of the business, and I actually really fell in love with regulatory just because there was a lot of different parts it integrated, and it was probably the most interesting of the rotations that I did, and then that's actually what I fell in love with doing. And also, it seemed like a job that couldn't be offshored, so it seems very specific to the country. So I did that. I selected that, and then I started in big pharmaceuticals, so like the Abbott, Takeda, Astellas of the world, and Gilead, and then worked my way to mid-size to small biotech, which I've been doing for the last 10 years. And I would say, in terms of the regulatory that I've done, I actually started out in post-approval CMC, did CMC, and then switched over to clinical, and then have picked up a bunch of pieces along the way. So from, the publishing aspect that most people don't see, to non-clinical with small biotechs, to labeling, ad promo type stuff. I'm not saying an expert in those, but it's things that you pick up in small biotech just because you have to wear a lot more hats than just in a bigger pharmaceutical.
Yeah. It's a fairly traditional journey. You go into one area, you try other things, you try the big companies, you go to smaller ones, you wear the hats, and you kind of, you're not an expert in everything, but you've done enough of it where you can have a conversation, go, right, what do you need from me? It's a fairly common journey. One that we don't see too much of these days with more specialisms. But, your career so far, you've worked at some great companies and you're doing some exciting stuff now. And one thing that you've mentioned repeatedly on our phone calls, how much you love regulatory. I know you touched on a little bit there, but what is it exactly about it? Is it the science, the problem solving, or is there something else?
So I would say, it's a combination of a lot of that. I would say that regulatory is one area that I think people consider part science, part magic, in terms of, do I know what percentage FDA is going to do whatever, or,
Yeah.
likely is it that Australia is going to ask this question, right? And so
Hmm.
I think those are the things that make it kind of more magic. The magic part I'm joking with, but it's experience, right? So kind of the hot topics for regulatory authorities. You start learning your counterparts at FDA and what might trigger them in a certain division versus another division. And then
Hmm.
within that, it's like you work with the project manager long enough, you understand how the flow is going to go, right? And so you can predict, hey, we're going to probably get inquiries in like Thursdays, Fridays, because their schedule is like Tuesday, Wednesday, they're probably meeting, And so there's that piece of it. And the science piece is really cool. You get to be a partner with clinical, with R&D, with CMC to see how a drug actually gets developed. I would say that there's a lot of bright minds that come into drug development, and people who, for the most part, truly care about wanting to help patients. And I think the biggest thing that I get excited about is working with these people to get to the next hurdle, right? Because it's a long journey, drug development. Generally, they say, quote unquote, it takes 10 years to do, plus or minus 5 years on either side, depending on how lucky you
Hmm.
get or how far along that drug was when you took it over. But you get to work with these very talented people where you collaborate, exchange ideas, figure out how to problem solve. And then the regulatory piece is understanding how to describe what essentially you're experts in to the regulators so they also understand and catch up with you to where you're at. Also,
Hmm.
these regulators, I feel bad for them. They have a ton of dossiers going on that they have to review. All these things are coming through. And at the same time, like with FDA, there's a lot of things going on in the
Yeah,
background.
yeah,
And at the same time, they really care about patients enough to want to do the right thing every time. And so I view it as a partnership across not just the sponsor, but also the health authority. And then at the same time, you're kind of translating back and forth what the intent of both sides are trying to do?
and I suppose that's the kind of the magic element of it. It's so much you'd have to balance, and it's intuitive in a way. Whereas I suppose the impression is you have to know it, whereas a lot of it's intuition. So taking everything you said there, do you think there was a particular moment in your career where regulatory clicked for you, where it's like, okay, I think I've got a good handle on this now?
Yeah, I would say, it's an evolution, at least for me. It went from, can I fill out the forms correctly to, do I understand how everything's put together, to, I would say about my fourth or fifth company in, about 7 to 10 years in, that it clicked. And that clicking means that, like, I understand why we're doing what we're doing, but
Hmm.
also I understand what is actually important to the regulators. Things that as a company we might miss, that it's, hey guys, we also need to talk about this, or we need to define this. And sometimes you get pushback from your own team. They're like, well, they never asked for it. It's like, understood, but this is something that is in this space, or that they've kind of mentioned before. We should
Yeah,
address it head on. And it's funny. FDA sends, I think, pretty straightforward requests, or ask questions. And there's a lot of ways to misinterpret it, Connor. Like, I will tell you the experiences that I had where people are like, I think they're saying this. And it's like, that's not even, I don't think that's even close to what they're asking for. But, it's like either overinterpretation of what FDA wants, or underinterpretation of what FDA wants. And
yeah,
both are driven by a sense of wanting to do the right thing, but also a bit of panic, like, oh, the regulators are all over this. It's like, no, they put their pants on one leg at a time too.
yeah,
No,
yeah,
they just, this question came up, they just want you to answer it, and they'll move on. And I've had experiences where if they're really concerned, they will let you know that they're concerned. Otherwise, a lot of times it's going to be a dialogue with them. And then the other thing I would say, Connor, to actually follow up and answer the first question that you asked, just to put a little bit more detail to it. So I actually graduated with bio and political science, and I feel like
hmm,
this is the one job where I get to use both degrees in terms of making sure the messaging is clean from a political science type standpoint, and understanding history, and then the science part of it, right? And so I feel lucky that things that I majored in, I could actually apply forward.
yeah. And I suppose the politics bit, we talked before about how regulatory, where it sits. You've got, the company you work for and the drug that you're trying to take to market. You've got the patient population you're trying to treat and overall public health. And then you've got, the government agencies. And you're kind of in the intersection trying to give the right information to each person whilst trying to not give too much, or, it's always trying to find the right balance. So the fact that you mentioned the political piece actually has helped you. It makes complete sense because you're essentially the politician for the drug. You've got to make sure you tell the narrative right at certain points. And you mentioned, obviously, the FDA is always making these guidances and people saying, okay, they want it like this. The first topic that I wanted to get into was regulatory not being a cookie cutter position and an entity. We've discussed this a few times, and you highlighted that there might be a tendency for people to go to precedent or what's been done before, but you've suggested many times that this can actually be the wrong approach depending on the product science and risk profile. So my first question would be, when people say regulatory follows precedent, where do you think that mindset breaks down?
Great question, Connor. So I would say where regulatory precedent comes down is, I feel, in two places. One, if you're doing something brand new, there's no precedent. So
Hmm.
for you to basically own the space, to be the first one there, means that you understand your drug well enough to understand that FDA has two things that, or any regulator has two things that they're concerned about. It's this risk benefit equation, right? And so the test, or how you develop it, or what patient population you go into, you always have to think about it in that sense. And if you don't have precedent, there's not some like you said, cookie cutter approach, a
Yeah,
checklist
yeah.
that you can go down. So you have to figure out what is applicable and what isn't. And I've seen companies that actually put too much of a burden on their own drug, thinking that that's what's required because they think that it's something that somebody else has done before is actually applicable to what they've done. And then I would say
Mhm.
the second time is, you know, you might be in a certain class of drugs, but your drug has a slightly different mechanism that changes the risk benefit profile. And so do you really want to do what everybody else is required to do? Or can you try and work through an explanation to FDA to say, our mechanism is actually slightly different or different, and we feel the risk benefit is actually different than what this class of other drugs does, right? I would say that those are two precedents. But I'll tell you another thing, Connor.
Go on.
I there's a lot of people that I've met that think that just regulatory people themselves that think that, hey, I've done it this way, I can apply it forward everywhere else.
Yeah, yeah.
It's one of the biggest things that I feel like is a disservice to the company and to the drug because you have to spend some time understanding actually how the company is going to operate.
Hmm.
Is it risk on, risk off type of company? And then the second thing is this drug something that you could really just apply cookie cutter approach to? Or do you have to understand some of this nuance that is required for this particular drug? And I feel like there's a lot of people I've met that like, hey, I know all the regulations, 21 CFR this, or EMA guidance this,
Yeah,
or
yeah.
PMDA this. And then it's like, well, is application applicable to what we're doing? And in that sense, people talk about AI and stuff like that. I feel like regulatory people who fear AI are the ones who like cookie cutter their way through.
Yeah, yeah.
But when you talk to people, when you understand the drug, you understand where you're at, and then there's a lot more nuanced approach. Because Connor, if you had AI works when you have 100% of the information and you know where you want to go, right?
Yeah, yeah.
I would say 60 to 70% of the time, when you hit the next bump in the road along drug development, you don't have all the information. You are making your best educated guess to say, hey,
Yeah, yeah.
this is where we're at. Based on the initial preliminary data, this is how I think we should move forward. Or you say, hey, we need to take a pause here and figure out what else we need to gather before moving forward. And I think AI can't tell you that. That's
No, it
something that,
can't.
right? And after you do it for a while, you understand, okay, I have enough information, just this intuition thing or this experience thing that you've developed. You know that you want to move forward because really you can't gather much more information and you just have to make a call.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's just a 50-50 coin flip of how you're going to get there. And then other times it's like, whoa, we have not a ton more information and we need to actually sit tight and gather more before we make a decision. And that latter one has been probably one of the hardest things I've learned. I'm I'm go, go, go. I'm kind of impatient, but I've learned from actually quite a few people who I respect where I've seen them pause and say, hey, Sterling, like, I think we're missing this. We got to wait a few more days to figure that
Yeah,
out,
yeah.
or we could actually make a decision. And I've seen better decisions from that by just saying, let's stop and pause and figure out how to best move forward. Sorry, that's a topic that I absolutely love,
No, no, it's a great insight, and you touched on a few points that I wanted to follow up on. But I suppose my summarization of what you just said there is that's essentially the art and the craft of the job. It's you know there's a lot of intuition on it. We can follow as much guidance. We've got this data. We believe in it. We present it. Okay, we've hit something as an unknown entity here. Let's think about. Let's take a step back. And I spoke to many people, and they say that the true growth in this job is understanding what you don't know and saying, okay, we need to look into this further, speak to different people, get different ideas, and then come to another conclusion. That's where a lot of the growth happens from when I've spoken to people. It's understanding, okay, we don't know this. Let's not push our luck a little bit. And you touched a little bit on these bits here, but the question I've got for you now is, where do you see people relying too heavily on past approvals or guidance? And do you think that comes from inexperience, organizational pressure? And from what you said there, it sounds like it might come from a bit of inexperience, is what I got from your statement then.
So, I would say that, and this is where I think you've hit on it, and I'm going to say it a different way. Those experienced people, those people who really truly get regulatory, they understand that there's a lot more gray out there that they don't understand that they need to further define. Because a yes, no, a really black and white answer is so easy. Like any person can do it if they're following precedent, right? And I would say people who do that have a rigid mindset. What I mean by that is they're like, I have this amount of experience. This is the only way to do it. I've read all the regulations and this is how it applies. And what they don't realize is science hasn't been fully figured out yet. You know, there's a lot
Yeah.
more that we're still trying to understand. And that rigid mindset is actually detrimental to the company and to the drug because they come in at it with, I know everything. And there's an infallible mentality to it, kind of a hyper ego that I'm the internal sheriff in town and this is what we
Sure.
need to do. But like, I feel like, you know, regulatory people worth their salt, they are very flexible. They're like, I've had this experience that's opposite of this experience that, you know, doesn't even come close to this experience. And when they approach a problem, they approach it new. Like every time they're like, hey, have I seen this before? Can I apply anything? Or is it a fallacy to apply this to this particular
Yeah.
situation? And so I know tons of people with degrees in like PhDs or docs um, who apply this mentality. And you know, it's one of those things where I feel like at the end of the day, it's hard for somebody to say, I just don't know. And I think,
Mhm.
like you said, that's the true growth of a regulatory person is I don't know. Here's some of the experience and here's how I think I'm going to apply it.
And I suppose I was going to follow that up with, and again, you kind of answered a bit of it already. What does good regulatory judgment look like compared to just having a strong regulatory knowledge? And you kind of gave the two examples of that growth mindset versus this is how things are done. You kind of touched a little bit there.
So I would say um, the difference is AI can give you true regulatory knowledge, right? It could
Hmm.
um, basically scrape the internet and pull applicable regulations to what you ask the question towards. True, like somebody who really knows and understands regulatory says, okay, those are those guidances. I've had experience with these. I got to figure out which ones are applicable to what we're doing now or not applicable, and then
Hmm.
piece it together from the feedback that you get internally with the team, and then understanding that that drug can only do so many things, right? And understanding truly like how it's applicable or how it's not in a situation that has at least more than one input from regulatory knowledge, right? It's you have at least input from the drug itself from a risk benefit standpoint, and then you have input from a development standpoint from your team that says, "Hey, this is where we're at. This is what we understand."
Hmm.
Like you said, is this an educated guess or not?
Is that something that can be taught? Or do you think that just comes with experience?
You know, I think it's and I'm gonna give you a cop out answer. It's probably not the best, but here's my opinion. I'm gonna give it a go. Um,
Yeah.
I think it's a bit of experience and it's a bit of innate personality, right? So,
Okay.
um, and here's what I mean. So I've worked with people who have been doing this for like just as long or even longer, or people who have starting with their career or in the middle of their career have seen the
Yeah.
spectrum of regulatory people along their career path. But there's some people who early on in their careers that you could see like really bright, really understands very quickly. I wish I was that quick when I started, but like they could
Yeah.
understand very quickly. You need to understand things better. You need to know how to apply it, and those people get it really early. And then I've seen people who've done it for 30 years with a PhD mindset that says I know everything, and realistically, to do everything in regulatory is a hard task to say that
Yeah.
you've done
Yeah.
everything, right? But these people think they've done everything, and they're like, my way is the only way that, and this is my understanding is the only correct way, right? And then there's a brittleness to their approach because it kind of, if you really challenge and try to figure out, there's a brittleness to it that shatters them, right? Where when they start seeing things that are wrong in their approach or whatever, there's a shutdown piece of it where I've seen people shut down and say like, no, this is the only way. And it's like, hey, no, what about these other things? What about this guidance that talks about it that gives you space to operate in, right? And
Hmm.
some people embrace that freedom to operate, and there's some people who are like, I don't want to do that, and this is the only way I know how to do it. Which, if it's a tried and true drug that's not that, you have to be that innovative on, fine, just follow the precedent that was set, follow what's been done, right? But I would say the people who love it love the freedom to operate in that gray space, to
Hmm.
do and to understand things that they have to make decisions on, right? Not that they have to follow rules on or their own checklist of ideas.
So would you say that what separates someone who understands regulations from someone who can apply them effectively is the embracing of that grey area?
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. You nailed it. You nailed it. And I think AI still hasn't eaten our lunch there in the gray space.
Yeah.
So I think this is where regulatory people truly are gonna show themselves, right? Because as AI evolves, any company is gonna say like, hey, I want to understand the knowledge piece of this, right? The black and white piece of it. But how I apply it, bit of experience and a bit of critical thinking, that's hard.
And to follow up the AI bit,
Yeah.
it's one of those things that I hear repeatedly from friends and family. It's if you know what you're talking about, AI is completely stupid. If you
Yes.
don't know what you're talking about, it's fantastic. It knows everything. And so I still, when I am using, I still go, maybe I'll apply that with a pinch of salt. But thanks for the framework. I'll take it from here.
Yeah.
I think that's still probably the best way to do it. And I think that's where I don't think AI is ever going to replace regulatory as a function. I can understand how different aspects of it, maybe some of the operational side, but in terms of the strategy piece and the creativity
Yeah.
and, being that cross-functional person to integrate everybody, it's never going to take that away because that's the people part of the job, and that's what makes drug development a human endeavor as opposed to just a manufacturing process of here's R&D, there's the drug, it does this. And that kind of ties me into the next section I wanted to go into was we talked a lot about how regulatory has changed over the years and also how it really is the thread that weaves between every department. And so we discussed before about how it's not just an executive function anymore, it just sits across the system, and you've described it as an integrator of the decision making process as opposed to just a function that delivers submissions. So my question following all that would be, when you describe regulatory as the integrator, what does it actually look like day to day for those who don't know?
Yeah. Great question, Connor. And I actually I want to go back to what you said. I think it's the most appropriate way of saying it. Drug development is a human endeavor. It's for
Yeah.
humans, and it takes human thought around it, and
Mhm.
care and a drive to do it. I'm going to use that. I'm sorry, but I feel like that's the best description of what we do. I've heard a lot of different things, but it's a human endeavor, and drug development really is like it's truly for what it does and what the purpose of it. Sorry, it's one of the things as you were talking, I was like, wow, like that's one of the most beautiful ways of saying what we do, right? And so, sorry,
Mhm.
I got a little bit sidetracked,
No, I appreciate it.
but
It's the accountability piece for me.
yeah,
It's humans who are making things for other humans. That
yeah,
is that's the service aspect for it. It's hard, it's expensive, but the second you take away a human out of that process, there's an ethical dilemma to it. And so, it is a human endeavor, this, and that's where the accountability comes into it, and as well as the purpose. And that's where I've always said I don't think AI is ever going to take over this industry in the way people like to say it will,
yeah.
because it simply can't. It's people helping people, and that's where accountability lies. And if you do something wrong, there's a result of it. You can't blame an AI for that, but you can say, why did you guys do this? This has implications. But
Yeah.
anyway, moving back to the integration of the system, what does
Yeah.
it actually look like day to day as a cross-functional leader?
So day to day, this is what it looks like. So a team runs into a problem. They want to figure out how to best approach it, right? And so there's a very pure technical approach, and I can give you even recent examples of what I've done that talk about it. But they run into a problem. They're like, we can solve it this way, and it's a pure technical approach to it. But from a regulatory standpoint, you're like, that doesn't make sense. Generally, this is a standard that we go off of. The problem that you're bringing in adds a complexity to it that we need to actually simplify and make clearer about how we're approaching, like either dealing with impurities or there's a protocol deviation that we need to deal with. And so day to day, what you deal with, at least in a person who's kind of more of a generalist like myself, you are more like a problem solver from the day-to-day aspect of it. But then as this integrator, and I like this word that you used, is this integrator piece is, you understand where like CMC and clinical is at and non-clinical is at, and then you say, hey, based on the phase of development that we're at right now, these are the things that we absolutely need to do. Because everybody's approaching it from their strict functional standpoint. But you're like, hey,
Hmm.
clinical's not caught up yet. We're a little bit too far, let's say, from a non-clinical or a CMC standpoint. Based on our runway, let's not waste the money that way and finish up and give clinical a chance to catch up, or CMC
Hmm.
a chance to catch up, or non-clinical to catch up. And we need to coordinate this with across all the functions, right? And so I feel like, when you're a few years in, when you start, you're a few years in and you've done it for a while, you deal with the day-to-day problems, understanding the larger picture of in that function what it is that you want to do. But
Hmm.
after you've done it for a while and you've taken on more of a general, like specifically for me, a more generous
Yeah.
role, you kind of see how all the functions are working. And then you say, hey, based on this, we need to do this. Based on that, these other functions are implicated, right? And so sometimes like CMC or clinical doesn't understand why I'm insisting that we should do it this way. And it's like
Hmm.
after several conversations, it's like because of this other function, we need to do these other things for it, right? So like, let's say that we find out from animal tox studies that this really hits like the kidney or liver. Well,
Hmm.
okay, hey, at some point we're gonna have to understand how the PK works through the liver and
Yeah.
a kidney. That we're gonna need to understand what it looks like for patients who have low functions of those organs, right? And
Yeah.
be able to talk about it. And so it's one of those things where we have to come together and know where we're going. And a lot of times, I'm not saying all the time, and I'm not saying like there's this foresight ability that you gain when you join regulatory. It's not any of that. What it is
Yeah. Yeah.
from experience and from the regulations, you know generally what's coming next. And what you want to do is if you if they're if you want to if you're worth your weight in salt, like you want to make sure that the team is prepared for that, and the
Hmm.
team is not prepared functionally individually, but the team is prepared together. Because you know like things that the best way to describe it, an analogy that I have is like a single string or a single bunch of strings next to each other can easily get cut, right? But when you
Hmm.
start twisting and knotting it, makes it much more difficult to undo, right? And I feel like part of a regulatory person's job is to make sure that everything gets integrated. So it's a much stronger argument. It's a much stronger case that you build to say, hey, clinical complements CMC, CMC complements clinical, and then
Hmm.
non-clinical complements both and back. So it's a virtuous cycle of trying to help all the functions do the right thing.
And is that something companies actually structure for, or does that depend on the individual, the regulatory person themselves? Do they have to make those connections? Is it embedded in how a company grows? Could you go into that a bit more detail?
Yeah. So I would say that a lot of companies don't do that. And, kind of just being realistic from big to small. And what happens is that they break it into subspecialties, right? The CMC
Yeah.
regulatory person sits with the CMC regulatory person. The clinical regulatory person sits with the clinical regulatory person. And then they have an overall boss, but there might be a bunch more programs, right?
Yeah.
And it's not often that the CMC folks really talk to the clinical folks and say, hey,
Right.
what's going on there? How will it impact me? And then the CMC folks explaining how it'll impact the clinical regulatory folks. And then
Mhm.
non-clinical is kind of like you do a whole bunch of work up front and then you forget about it, right? But there are implications from the work that you've done early on, late, more towards like when you're trying to finish up.
Mhm.
And I don't think a lot of companies do a great job of trying to integrate that and understand this more integrated dynamic to drug development. And so I would say that specifically to your question, when you start siloing and saying, this is my only specialty, there's a bit of support that's lost when you don't know what the other functions truly are doing or how it impacts you.
And do you think companies underutilize regulatory strategically?
Oh, great question. I would say, yeah. I mean, I think it's, you have enough, and I'm just going to say this, but you have enough bad experiences with regulatory people who are pedantic about like, hey, you got to follow this regulation. I think they just
Yeah.
like, hey, fill out the forms and get it done, right? I think a lot of people think that way. I would say that, partners that I've had, and leaders that I've worked with that truly get regulatory, understand how important it is. And a lot of times they're just trying to bounce ideas off of to say like, hey, I've gotten ideas from these other people from a regulatory standpoint. What do you think? How should we approach this?
Hmm.
How will it impact drug development timelines? Or are there things that we need to worry about? And a lot of times, like big pharma gets the full landscape of things, but they're not intimate about that particular drug development, right? And,
Sure.
and so it's hard for them to say to a regulatory person, give me strategic direction on that one drug. It's like, give me a strategic direction on these 10 compounds that we have in this huge
Sure.
pipeline, And so it's like a lot of it gets lost and you use like generic approaches to that, right? And
Hmm.
then for small biotechs, a lot of times it's like, help me survive to the next funding round, right?
Hmm.
We got like about 6 months to a year left. How do I survive another year? Not like, hey, in 2 or 3 years, where will we be? Did we spend our money correctly to get it into the best position possible? And so
Hmm.
I see it in both, right? In big pharma and small biotech, where there's a not a true utilization of a regulatory person on the program that they're keenly focused on, right? And so it's more other factors play in. There's too many drugs, or we don't have enough money to do these things properly. And I get it, and I get both sides. It's
Hmm.
just I would say like people that I've really liked working with are like, okay, let's take out all this noise. What do you think? How would you develop this, or how would you approach it from a regulatory standpoint?
I was going to ask you, what are they missing by doing that? But I felt you've covered it quite succinctly there. So I suppose I'll go into another facet of it, which be, what does a company look like when regulatory is fully embedded in that decision-making process,
Yeah,
as opposed to, oh, we're going to do this. Can we get your thoughts on it?
yeah. Um, I'll give you an example of, and this is mainly small biotech approach, right? And so, um, a company that's fully integrated, a regulatory person who's fully integrated into a company, they make decisions that can explain the decisions that they make. And here's what I mean.
Hmm.
So a lot of companies are like, we want to go fast. Small biotech's like, we want to go fast. We have X amount of dollars.
Sure.
We're going to start in the US. And I've had clients like this too, where I'm like, wait, why are you doing the US if you want to go fast and you have a limited amount of cash, right? And they're like, what do you mean? This is the gold standard. And I said, okay, let me ask you a deeper question. Are you trying to get are you just trying to get the study started? Or
Hmm.
do you want to get human data? Or do you want to finish your phase one in record time? Or do you want to have everything and package it up so a strategic would be super interested? And a lot of times they're like, we want human data. I'm like, if you want human data, why are you starting in the US? And they're like, I don't even know what that means. And I'm like, other regions, other countries, like for instance, Australia, have
Yeah. Yeah.
different set of regulations that allow the expediency of getting drugs developed. Like I actually respect the balance that's there, right? So I would say that there's just enough in Australia where, from a CMC non-clinical standpoint, they understand this is still drug development. There's actually very little that you really truly know in phase one. So
Hmm.
might as well go out there and see what happens, right? Whereas FDA is a little bit more, hey, we want you to truly understand these things better so we don't have these bad incidents of like a crazy like grade 5 CRS or this other thing that we like these 1 in 1,000 type of situations. We want to
Hmm.
reduce that lower. 1 in 10,000 is what we prefer, right? And so I would say that when I had that conversation with a small biotech, I said, who's your regulatory person? Like, have you had this discussion about strategically how to approach it? Because it's we're talking about it from a US versus an Australia approach. But you know what,
Yeah.
Connor? We're talking about it from how much work does non-clinical have to do, how much work does CMC have to do, and how much work does
Hmm.
clinical have to do. In the US, non-clinical CMC has a disproportionate amount of work that has to be done. A
Hmm.
ton more background, a ton more, uh, and then in terms of like you have to have a GLP study to get started, right? Whereas in Australia, there's a lot more discussion about what it is that we feel comfortable enough as a sponsor company to go into that
Sure.
region, right? So sorry,
Okay.
that's another one where I'm
No.
like, man, like what are we talking about? Like what are we trying to do? Or like, yeah, there's other examples where it's like, how do you want to approach these things?
Yeah, and I think it's a relevant question because different companies have different cultures and different mindsets, and
Yeah.
that comes from either the investors they have on board, the original founding team, are they from academia, are they industry veterans, and that really does affect how they choose to act. And it increasingly becomes more apparent when I'm doing my job to try and find people that people are trying to find good regulatory people, be it just a consultant or their first regulatory hire a lot earlier, even around the R&D stage, just so they have someone they can actually bounce these ideas off and say, okay, is this feasible? What's out there already? What would this actually look like if we were to, actually integrate this? Could we get funding for this? So I think it's a valid question and a valid point that the earlier you bring it in and you embed it in your processes as a company, just overall, I think it potentially gives you better outcomes, not just on the drug side, but even if it comes to getting investment or speaking to people and trying to speak to the agencies. I think it's good to have someone who speaks the language a lot earlier on, and I'm starting to see that as well.
Hey, Connor, I have a question for you, actually.
Yes,
Sorry, I know it's supposed to
I'm
go.
on the spot now.
I know,
I'm
I'm
meant to be
sorry.
interviewing
I
you.
know it's supposed to go one way, but you triggered something. So I have a question for you. How do you get when it's that diverse? Like, I just realized, like, you gave me insight into your job, like academic versus VCs versus industry veterans, right? How do you get them to buy into this concept that you need a regulatory person as a key input? And then at the same time, how do you match the people that you know from a regulatory standpoint to the specific need of that particular company? Like, how do you work that dynamic out?
Well, recruitment's a people game. It's people speaking to people, and a lot of that time you just have to know them. And I try to always avoid the generalization that someone who comes from straight from academia or someone who's just early VC company has the same mindset every time. You need to know the people.
Yeah.
And so with the academia side, it tends to be they like to surround themselves with industry experts very early on to help them go in the right direction, and very much like we want to get this to market, we believe in this product, we've been doing this for a long time, we want to make sure we're doing the right things. You tend to see a lot more, we need these leaders very early on, so they want to make sure on the right paths. When it comes to the companies that are very well funded very early on, a lot of the time it comes from their network who they've worked with before in the past. So they will go, look, this guy got this approval for me. Okay, well, we need him day one then. Let's get him locked in. So it really does depend on the experience they've had before. But in terms of to your second question about the regulatory person themselves, again, it goes down to mindset. There are people who say to me, I don't like working early stage, I like working late stage, or I don't want to do commercial. Or some people are like, I like being part of the whole journey. And a big part of it is just finding out, okay, what have you done before? What are you generally really passionate about? And what are you open to? And so, like I said, people who are really open and comfortable with the grey side of things, they tend to do a lot of consulting as well, and they're very open to being in something that's slightly more risky, not more developed, and going, okay, look, they have this idea here, they have this kernel, they want to get advice on it, and it potentially turns something much longer term. Again, to your earliest question earlier, and you went, well, it depends really. I suppose my answer is, well, it depends really. They're not, regulatory recruitment isn't cookie cutter. There isn't one profile fits all. So I'm going to throw it right back at you.
Yeah. But I actually really appreciate that insight, because I've never thought about the flip side of that, right? Because you meet colleagues who are like a certain way, and you're like, how do you fit that square peg into another square hole where you find it that person works? But sometimes just like I've seen mismatches. So like I do get what you're saying. It's like there's always going to be somebody for somebody. It's like eventually you'll find somebody that you could connect with.
Yeah.
And I think that part of that job is actually really hard to try and find the match.
I think as well, sometimes you have to make a mistake to realize, that wasn't a right fit, and that's where a lot of the growth comes from as well. I'm sure you've had it where you may have brought somebody in, they interviewed great and the background looked good, but it might have been, you know what, when it comes to day-to-day work, I don't think there's a lot of synchronization there. I don't know if we can partner for this part moving forward. And that happens. Sometimes that's part of the growth process of, being a hiring manager, as well as, building out a new company or trying to go from your first 10 hires to your first 100 hires. These growing pains are part of it. So it's just part of the process of the industry. And I wanted to kind of go back to the grey piece. Something we spoke about is combination therapies and the lack of clear frameworks. And obviously, I don't want you to go too much in detail of what you guys are doing now, because obviously it's private and confidential. But we talked about where there can be struggles where there isn't regulatory frameworks that apply fully. And so, as science evolves, especially with different types of combinations like drug-drug or drug-cell, it seems like regulations often playing catch up, which then can shift regulatory from execution strongly into interpretation. So, my first question on that piece would be, where do you see current regulatory frameworks breaking down with newer therapies?
Oh, wow, great question. And so, yeah, I would say that cell and gene therapy is cutting edge space. I mean, do we truly understand all the science? We feel like we do, but there's a understanding of the basics of the science to truly mastering that science. And I'll give you an example. So countries like Japan, they want to be cutting edge. I feel like,
Yeah.
from what I heard, they kind of feel like they missed a boat on biologics. But for cell and gene therapy, they're squarely in the forefront. They're approving drugs with at least a certain amount of mastery, right? And when I talk about mastery, and this is what I mean about, and maybe it's tangential to answering your question, but like small molecule and biologics. Listen, everybody knows how chemistry works, or for the most part, they understand the basics of chemistry to master it, right? To get what
Hmm.
you need. For biologics, enough CHO cells have been made, been fed, have been kept alive to get the biologic piece that we need out of it, right? Cell and gene therapy is, I feel like, is such a new relative space. We've been working on it for 30, 40 years. Like
Yeah.
it's been around, but true mastery of it, I think we're just starting to get there, right? Because think about even that space right now. We are in an auto space where it's like one for one to yourself, because that's all we
Hmm.
can truly understand and master. And even then, it's not 100% all the time, right? The hit rate for CAR Ts is, I forgot what the number is, but it's not as high as people think it is. And then whereas like, small molecule, you make a batch, 100%, no problem.
Yeah.
And it's cheap to make again, right? And
Hmm.
then we're now transitioning into this allogenic space where you are basically taking one donor and trying to apply it to a whole bunch of other people. And that's a truly, I feel like, the next stage that is developing. That's kind of where my company's at. And so does FDA know exactly how they should set regulations around the master of it? They don't. And you know what? They've given us enough space to operate in, and there's some guidances now around CMC and other things that talk about it. But for instance, like, they like there was a black box warning around CAR Ts around secondary malignancies, and it's like, do we truly know this enough? And then they pulled it back, and it's like, hey, do we truly know what cell and gene therapy does once it's in the system, right? Or
Hmm.
has it really hit the targets that we wanted? And so I know that there's a high level of confidence from scientific community once it looks like it's working, and they're saying like, yeah, we
Yeah.
got it. But true mastery is to say, hey, we can generally be over an 80 to 90% success rate in terms of manufacture. And then we understand it well enough that we know that these are going to be truly the off target effects that we should see in clinic. And so I would say that, that's just within like small molecule biologics and cell and gene therapy. And then you take that and then you say, hey, I'm going to take a small molecule and I'm going to take a cell therapy and I'm going to combine it together and see what happens. And
Yeah.
that in itself, like, FDA has guidances around combination therapy and talking about contribution elements, but how a small molecule will help a cell uh, is truly that next frontier, right? Where we're taking our mastery of small molecules to enhance the cell therapy that we truly don't understand fully, and we're learning to master, right? And that's the
Hmm.
part that's really exciting, is because we are progressing to a point where I feel like we're going to get to mastery soon of cell and gene therapy. And I feel like we're in, and I don't know, 5 years, a decade later, where we could say, hey, we truly understand this space, right? And like, and then cell and gene therapy is so broad that, like, you talk about from uh, mRNA to CRISPR to iPSCs. And this is where, like, true mastery isn't there either. It's like you haven't subdivided that either. Like to say like, hey, this like for CAR Ts, this is how you're supposed to do it.
Yeah.
For true cell therapy, this is how. And then within cells, there's so many different types of cells too. So it might behave differently as well. So sorry, Todd, I could go on for,
No, it's
but
good.
it's
It's good.
it's like a biological understanding of the cell that you're actually working with, and then can you enhance what it does with a small molecule that's out there, right? And so,
Yeah.
I mean, if you take a look at the company, you'll see that somebody was really thoughtful, and I think actually people were thoughtful about their approach of how to do a small molecule with a cell therapy, and it just didn't happen overnight.
Hmm. And I know that unfortunately we had to cut out a lot more of this path we were going down. We can always have a second show if you want to come back. But one thing I wanted to follow up on everything you said there is you mentioned that the guidance, they're trying their best. Yeah, agency, they're trying to try and make some precedent, trying to give guidance to people in general. And you mentioned obviously the whole drug sell, and that could be a future thing there. Is there a specific area or areas right now where guidance is particularly unclear, and then that means you guys have to, do a lot of the guesswork?
Yeah. I would say, there's more that's coming in from a CMC standpoint. And what I would say is like the ecosystem for small molecules and biologics, I feel like is fully developed, right? Like stuff around ADCs and, those areas, it's like, how to develop it from a non-clinical standpoint, a CMC standpoint, and a clinical standpoint. How do you take cells and do a non-clinical program around it? Or how do you do a targeted cell therapy that only hits human MH1s or MH2s and basically apply that in a monkey model or a rat model? And I think this is where FDA is struggling to say, hey, let's not use as many animal models, but at the same time, how do you ensure some amount of safety for humans when it's this novel of a concept? And then CMC, I mean, yes, there's basic framework that you work around, but like, can they give us more specific around this particular type of cell type? They can't, because it's new for them too. And so like, as experience is gained, they can say like with a certain cell type, like the CAR Ts that we develop, right? There's more information that they could give guidance for people who are coming into that space to say, this is what you should be doing or watching out for, right? And then even within CAR T, it's like, hey, it's only auto that they know. Allogenic, like, they're still, people are still trying to get a drug approved around the allogenic type of space,
And so how do teams internally actually try to navigate that uncertainty in practice? Because obviously that's where I imagine the integration piece really, that's a big craft piece there. That right, there is no guidance. We've got to figure something out. But how do you do that? How do you orchestrate that?
So, it's taking the principles that are out there, and there's some basic principle, right? Like, don't hurt patients. Let's try to make a drug that is potent and is supposed to do what it's supposed to do with the least amount of impurities that will cause off-target effects, right? And we understand consistency in the batch that we're making. Those general principles basically guide the framework for the road that you go on. And then you understand what kind of road it needs to be developed there. And then what kind of, going all the way with analogy, it's what kind of shoes you even put on for that kind of road, right? And so you take the principles and you try to narrow it down and apply it to what it is that you're actually doing and see if it's applicable or not. Because you know what? Like, you wouldn't go on a mud road and put on your fanciest shoes. That doesn't make sense at all, right? But you know what? If you don't actually understand shoes or mud road, you might be like, why? It protects your feet. Like, you can go, you can still walk, right? But it's like common sense. I've heard this saying, common sense is a comment, but like, it's like, does that apply? How do you apply something like that, right? And so I would say, Connor, that it's, that there's a road, that you have to put on certain shoes. How you do that, it's guided by, like we talked about before, a little bit of intuition, a bit of experience, and this kind of guiding principles that really everybody should go off of, right? Like, humans trying to help humans is the fundamental core principles. How we go do that in a CMC, non-clinical, and clinical standpoint, I think that's the magic of working together in teams,
And I've realised they're actually coming to the end of our conversation, and
Okay.
I'm generally gutted. I feel like every time we speak, we go on way past what we actually schedule in for. But for this time, I have to be strict. So we're going to finish up on a couple of quick fire questions for you. If you could answer in one or two sentences, that'd be great. So the first one is, what career advice do you wish you had received earlier?
I wish that I was told you don't have to go as fast to learn as much as you can. There's a lot of learning along the way. You don't have to keep pressuring yourself to do everything and because there's a part of it where it's like maybe you could have learned more by staying a little bit longer, or you learn more from the soft skills from these great leaders that you work with,
Mhm.
rather than the pure like drug development piece of it.
Okay. Second question is, if we were having this conversation again in 10 years' time, what do you think would have changed the most in regulatory affairs?
How accessible regulation and guidances are. Because right now, it's kind of a bit of a peck and dig for it, but I think it's going to be much easier to ask AI, hey, can you please pull up all the guidances around this?
And finally, what part of working in regulatory affairs do you enjoy the most?
I would say the interaction with people to solve problems is my favorite part.
Thank you very much, Sterling. And thank you for taking time to join the show and sharing your insights. It's been a genuine pleasure.
Thanks for the opportunity to speak with you, Connor, about regulatory.
No, it's all good. And if you use my line of drug development is a human endeavor, I expect some royalties.
Of
Now, so
course.
that's my line, okay? And to everyone who's watching, if you'd like to be involved in Regulatory Voices, feel free to reach out. If you have any questions or thoughts on this discussion, please share them in the comments. Reach out to me or Sterling. Send us questions. We'd love to interact with you. And Sterling, I'd love to have you on another show at some other point. But for now, I will leave you to it and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, Connor. Take care.